Hi, this is Paul. The Christian Reformed Church is currently embroiled in its same-sex marriage crisis. Crisis, as I noted in the video I did a little while ago, may result in the separation, breakup of the denomination, as it is doing in the Reformed Church of America. I've gotten emails from you about the United Methodists, various other denominations. It's a difficult thing. Part of what a lot of conservative people discuss is they say, well, this really isn't about the issue. This is about the hermeneutic. And in the case of the Christian Reformed Church, the Reformed hermeneutic. And we've been having a conversation on CRC Voices, which is a listserv that I participate in that focuses on the Christian Reformed Church. And this is often something that comes up. And of course, usually the conservatives bring that up, and the progressives usually bring up, well, what about the lives of these people? And as we were going back and forth on that on CRC Voices, one of the things that occurred to me is the question, what is this Reformed hermeneutic for? It's a Reformed hermeneutic. A hermeneutic is basically a rule by which you should interpret Scripture. But that interpretation of Scripture is, of course, nested in a great deal of context and assumption about who are we. All things just go down deep pretty quickly. And so the CRC conservatives note that changing the rules on something like same-sex marriage, they argued this 25, 30 years ago with respect to women serving as deacons, elders, and pastors, signals a larger slide in the church on more foundational matters. And in the Christian Reformed Church a generation ago, those who were advocating for women in church office, breathlessly promised that this wouldn't arrive at a question about homosexuality or same-sex marriage. And now, of course, not only is the CRC there, but many, many people who advocate for the change of the Christian Reformed Church towards same-sex marriage argue that, well, it's in fact linked. And I've seen that I've seen that intimated and sometimes said expressly with a number of people who are within the Christian Reformed Church. And so the conservatives then basically feel betrayed, and they say, yep, it was always about the Reformed hermeneutic, and we let it slide a generation ago, and so local options and these kinds of things, no, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. But now, to me, what that set up is the question, well, what exactly are we doing? What exactly are we looking for from the Bible? And again, if you really push that thought, you're going to discover that it's not quite so obvious. Are you looking for a good life? Now, in the Christian Reformed Church, molded by the Heidelberg Catechism, you might say misery, deliverance, gratitude. We're looking to please God with obedient, grateful service. But I'm also preaching through John 13, 14, 15, and Jesus is also pretty clear. If you love me, you'll keep my commandments. Okay, what are the commandments of Jesus? How do the commandments of Jesus relate to the commandments of Moses? Is the Bible sort of this bag full of rules, and if you pull out the rules and apply them to your life, then you please God? Okay, pleasing God means what exactly? It means having God hear your prayers. Jesus ties that in John 14 and 15. And that's there. So is it, what exactly are we looking for? And you've heard me many times deconstruct the Bible or deconstruct certain readings of the Bible when people say things like, well, if you do this, then you'll get that. Now, again, read the last part of the book of Deuteronomy. It's pretty clear. If you keep my commandments, you'll have all these things. And if you don't keep my commandments, you'll get all these curses. Covenant blessings, covenant curses. Is that how the Bible works? But then, of course, in the same-sex marriage controversy, people then bring up things like clothing of two different cloths or eating shellfish. And then they pretty much do sort of what, say, Sam Harris would do, but not at that level. And say, well, if the Bible is somehow this magic answer book, then it doesn't seem to work. And then, of course, Christians come back and say, no, well, there's ceremonial law, and then there's dietary laws, and Jesus put them aside, and Well, and the thing is, if you push a lot of these things a little bit harder and a little bit further, you very quickly begin to discover that it's not really necessarily a one-for-one biblicism, but it's people doing theology. They read the Bible and they come up with answers and they apply those answers, and the church is doing this. Now, the skeptics again continue to press on and say, yeah, but wait a minute, you're doing that process of theology is picking and choosing between chapters, and so it's not directly from the Bible. And so, well, how exactly is this Bible supposed to work, and work to what end? I mean, Jesus said things like, if they'll hate you like they hated me. And I will sometimes remind people that, well, if you live Jesus' way, you'll probably die Jesus' way. And then the promise is that you'll be raised in Jesus' way. And no, but wait a minute, I wanted a successful business and a happy family and a gratifying marriage. And I wanted all of these things here and now. And of course, in the first century when Jesus was doing his ministry, the Pharisees and the Zealots and the Essenes wanted the Romans out. And the Essenes wanted a good number of all the wobbly people out too. And many, some tolerated the Romans because that's about the best we can do. And others thought, well, the Romans are showing the way to really live in this world. And the Romans surely must have the endorsement of the gods because the Romans are winning. I've been watching The Last Kingdom. As I said, I really liked Vikings better. But there was this scene in The Last Kingdom when the Danes lose a battle, and the war leader of the Danes basically says, well, their God is with them. And then, next season early, that war leader gets baptized. One of the things that I do want to get into at some point is the question of it's basic religion in the world where outcomes reveal the will of the God or the gods, because that actually is deep within this conversation. Now it's pushed back against in Job, and it really takes a beating with Jesus, but then the resurrection comes around again, and what we have are these models. And, we need models, but all models that we construct are of limited value. And so we're dealing with all of these questions. And in many ways, whether I got an email from someone, it was a very, very nice email, very appreciative email, but he said basically, if you want to really process the question of same-sex marriage in the Christian Reformed Church, what you need are same-sex attracted people from the Christian Reformed Church on your channel. And that's fine with me, but that we've been pretty much playing that game with all of these decisions, and having people for whom their same-sex attraction is their first-hand experience is certainly valid data, but the people who are all over the map in other ways also have valid things to say, because the question is not, well, what exactly is the question? That's what this question about what is Reformed hermeneutics for, or, put in your Orthodox hermeneutics or Roman Catholic hermeneutics. And obviously the Protestant Reformation is a big player in here, because in many ways the Roman Catholic Church would say, thus says the church, but that's taken a beating too, pretty much from the Reformation. So there's a lot at play here. Let's move on to the next slide. I bumped into a video, so I've been kind of keeping my eye on the God is Gray channel, because, let's see, this will come out after the little short video about deconstructing. I try to keep my eye on I can't keep my eye on everyone, but I try to keep my eye on different voices that express different aspects of the community. And so God is Gray, I noticed, had Pete Enns on. And Pete Enns, some of you know exactly who Pete Enns is. And I know who you are, because we've spoken about it via email or in private conversations. Peter Enns was a professor of Old Testament at Westminster East, and he had a controversy over a book Inspiration and Incarnation. And actually, I read that book, and I really liked the book. But that book stirred up a controversy at Westminster East, which is a seminary started by the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, which was a split off of the Presbyterian Church of the USA. Conservative split off, and the Orthodox Presbyterian Church is more conservative than the Christian Reformed Church. They do not allow women deacons or women elders or women pastors. They're arguably more conservative than the Presbyterian Church of America. I know this is very hard for some of you to keep track of, and don't bother. Presbyterian Church of America is Tim Keller's denomination, which is also in some ways more conservative than the Christian Reformed Church, because the Christian Reformed Church does allow women serving in church office. So Pete Enns wrote that book while he was on staff at Westminster East, and it didn't go well, and he lost his job, and now he's teaching at Eastern College. And it's been very interesting sort of following the path of Pete Enns. In some ways, he, as a legitimate Old Testament scholar, has been kind of being the voice of progressive evangelicalism. I remember his conversations with Rachel Held Evans, his conversations with just a variety of people. And so Pete Enns keeps writing books about a bunch of the hot button issues. And I didn't know that he wrote this book, How the Bible Actually Works, and in which I explain how an ancient, ambiguous, and diverse book leads us to wisdom rather than answers, and why that's great news. In some ways, the casualty of the book is the good news. And I'll have to talk a little bit more about that, because, and this has sort of been typical of what I've seen in this camp. And there certainly is an element of this camp that's in the Christian Reformed Church. An element of that camp, 4 years ago might have looked at me as perhaps even a leader of them, because I've not been a rock-ribbed conservative in the Christian Reformed Church in its own little ongoing culture war. But I've read a number of Pete Enns' books, and this one was actually, I guess now Amazon Prime. I'm an Amazon Prime member. Now I can read certain books on Amazon Prime, so I didn't even have to buy it. I was just able to open it and go through it. And books like these that are geared to a popular audience can often be sort of had with a good skimming. I got to be careful here. They're pitched to a broader audience, and so the book has plenty of illustrations. And hey, I do that too. I'm a preacher. That's what we do, and I know that's what communication demands. But if you're just sort of trying to figure out where he's landing in the playing field, well, a good skim will do it. And again, some might hear a lot of the things that I say and say, well, in some ways you agree with Pete Enns, and that's true. The Bible is not a magic 8-ball. The Bible is not a rule book, although there are rules in it. The Bible gives wisdom. I agree with all of those things. The Bible doesn't address some things like we want it to, like Brett Weinstein's no nuclear refinement. The way that the Bible addresses many of our contemporary issues, and this is a lot of what I've been doing over the last 3 years. It's really easy to say the Bible doesn't address many of these issues that we're wrestling with directly. That is right, and Pete Enns is right in that. But that doesn't mean that we don't gain anything from the Bible, and Pete Enns would say that's right, we're supposed to gain wisdom. But then when I look for really a deep dive into the kind of wisdom we need, I don't find it in here. Now, maybe it's a popular book. Maybe if I had a longer relationship with Pete Enns and really pressed him on things. Because what I tend to find is that it sort of makes the Bible rather useless. What do we need a reformed hermeneutic for? What do we need the Bible for? How is the Bible supposed to work? That's a very good question. And I think that there are answers, and in some ways my channel wrestles with those questions and works on those answers, and you do that together with me. I had 2 randos conversations today. I don't know if either of them will be published. And I know a lot of you are like, I can't find a slot. I know you can't. I can't just, if I open up all the slots, I won't be able to have my day job, and I won't be able to do these videos, and I won't be able to do some of the other conversations I should do. So it's a balancing act. So I open up slots almost every week. But not every week. And there'll be a couple weeks towards the end of the month that I won't open them up again because I've got some other things going on. So that's the way this thing goes. But the question is, well, how does the Bible work? Well, so then I listened to some of his conversation with God is Gray. And basically the first 20 minutes of this video is sort of all about I don't have to self-tyrannize about premarital sex or gays. That's basically what it comes down to. And it's a lot of people who feel that they were tyrannized by their church and they have all this post-traumatic tyranny built up into them, and someone comes along and says, no, it's blurry. Oh, good, it's blurry. Then I can do what I want. You could have always done what you wanted. Well, yeah, but I was raised by a church that had, well, I was in our culture with, I was raised by a church that taught me in a certain way. So I internalized the tyranny, and that gave me a lot of anxiety and negative emotion. Of course, Jordan Peterson and Big Five personnel say, well, you're probably higher in neuroticism and negative emotion. Well, don't use the neuroticism thing. But, and okay, I get that, but then the same group turns around and starts, reforming a new self-tyranny about privilege and whiteness. And it's like, no, wait a minute. Here's the funny thing about freedom. It's selective. I mean, you're simply not going to care about anything, and you're going to be a thoroughgoing libertarian. Well, you're going to have to live that out. And I point this out to people all the time. They're like, well, I just don't think we should police sexuality. Really? Why all the hand wringing about Governor Cuomo and his dating life? And okay, you have new rules. And that's why I turned to a website like Everyday Feminism. And it's like, okay, all those old rules have to go, but here are all the new rules. And it's like, that's the point. You need rules. And so progressive evangelicals try to blunt reported childhood trauma by blurring things. But other things they don't see quite as so blurry. And many of the other things they don't see quite as so blurry are, surprise, surprise, seemingly the product of new formation in new cultural moralities. And again, I'm not condemning them as I do that, but I just want to point out that you've just switched one set of tyrannies for another. And maybe you're happier with your new set, okay. But, you just set up this narrative of, it's, in some ways, tell it to your therapist. Because that's what's going on here. The world has changed, and you're changing the rules, and you want mommy and daddy's approval with your new rule changes, and you want them to stop. And, okay. The far deeper questions are, why are the rules changing? And should the rules be changing? And what exactly are we doing with this? And, all the really bigger questions that I tend to find my new conversation partners are actually dealing with what I think are these deeper questions with then, what should gays do, and what can and can't women do? And, well, why? Where's that all coming from? And if you look around, blurry lenses make for weak communities. The church as platform, at least the main line, they've been the ones blurring lines all along, and it's done nothing for them as organizations. It's done nothing for them as communities. And so God is Gray in some ways is way more successful than mainline churches. And probably has exactly their audience and an audience of evangelicals that are deconstructing. That's the platform. She's your priestess. I know you wanted one. Well, there she is. Action is decision, and people want to know what to do. And so if you actually look at churches who will tell you exactly what to do, they do pretty well as communities. And this observation was made a long time ago by a lot of sociologists that basically recognize that a lot of these communities function. You have a community because you are countercultural. You need the community to maintain your belief. And you seek out a community, and you're committed to the community, and you give money to the community, and you do all of this in order to maintain the belief. Now, a lot of the dissatisfaction with mass media and news outlets has been, well, the narrative to reporting ratio is off. And now, partly because of pluralism and diversity, it's increasingly difficult for mass media to sort of hold their hegemony of narrative. And I think that's very much analogous to church. And I thought in Jordan Peterson's question and answer, boy, he had a lot of good questions and answers in that video. One of his arguments about the media was, well, what about social media and echo chambers? And Peterson said, well, but what social media has also done is sort of diversify the amount of information out there. What it's actually done is diversify the narratives. And in many ways, that's very much what's happening in churches. Because, well, people might, you might blur the old answers, and you might blur the old ways that the community, what was the Reformed hermeneutic for? It was so the community could guide itself according to the Word of God. There, I could say it that way. But guide itself towards what? And what's interesting is that kind of the genius of that traditional approach was it guides itself towards the community come what may. Many of them hoped that God would bless the community for their obedience, which of course sets up a lot of soul searching when you don't seem to be getting blessings. And parents who baptize their infants deal with this all the time. But I don't notice that people who got baptized as teenagers deconstruct at any lower levels than people who baptized as infants. So they get to deal with it too. So, blurry lenses make weak communities. Or at least they bring the proliferation of platforms. Because the truth is, fact and narrative will always go together. And a lot of the question is, how much counter-narrative facts, how much dissonance can you really tolerate and not lose your narrative? Because ideally, the narrative, it's the whole center set, bounded set dynamic. A bounded set is sort of bounded by a bunch of facts. A center set is sort of the narrative, but they actually move together because, well, you're always interpreting facts by narrative, and you're always adjusting your narrative by the facts. It's a little bit opponent processing. It's sort of migrating together. Now, I just started Tara Isabel Burton's Strange Rights, and I often listen to audiobooks if I'm going to sleep, because I need something that has just the right amount of interest to draw my attention, but not too much interest to keep me awake. And this one kept me awake. Now, that's unusual, because I drive my wife crazy, because if I actually pick the television program that we're watching, something that I'm interested in, I'll invariably fall asleep to it, and then she's stuck watching what I wanted to watch, and so I usually just hand her the remote. Don't tell her I said that. She knows I say that. But if she says, oh, Paul's been talking about you in your videos, then I'm in trouble. I'm kidding. And what we've been seeing, and what she documents quite interestingly, is sort of this buffet personal religion. And it opens with this, this interactive role-playing theater type thing that I had never heard of any of this stuff that was going on in New York and I guess all over the world. And she rightly, I mean, of course, she has a degree in theology from Oxford, so she's at least well educated with respect to religion. And it's not unlike the fact that people often go into the therapy profession because they want to heal themselves. Just because someone has a divinity degree doesn't mean, now maybe someone can do a response video and say, Paul doesn't trust his guild very much either. Well, a lot of this arises because of institutional skepticism. And usually when that happens, so now we're skeptical about what's coming from the outside, then we sort of turn inward, and this secret, sacred self, we sort of look down the well and see a foggy reflection of ourselves and can't recognize ourselves, and there's the revelation. But we're blind to the formation, but as this goes, patterns emerge, and we can look around at other people and say, I'm not sure it's divinity talking. It's probably their childhood. It's the tyranny that they had from their evangelical upbringing, or it's the lack of structure that they had because their parents were hippies. Or if you actually know their parents, then you can have a higher resolution view. And patterns emerge, but not me. I'm not formed by my environment. I have the truth. Everyone else is formed by their environment. And these buffet personal religions are a little bit, can be sort of like drinking salt water to quench your meaning crisis thirst. In order for it to be compelling, again, the whole facts and narratives dynamic, it's got to be true out there, and it's got to work in the physical world, and religion is always doing this self-checking back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Now, Paul Rossi's the end of that video, which was, again, it was very interesting, but I've heard it 1,000 times, 1,000, maybe not 1,000, but a few hundred times, and many of them are on this channel, and especially the earlier videos. A blurry vision won't help you much in a meaning crisis. And so, he was an altar boy, raised in the Catholic Church, left it all behind, and then Jordan Peterson's new psychological genus concordism kind of said, hey, maybe there's something to the Bible. And, well, why do you go back to a crunchy church tradition? Why do you go back to a church tradition that says, it's just all kind of data out there, and you've got the Bible, and you've got Shakespeare, and you've got these other books? And I'm not saying that's what Pete Enns believes. I think Pete Enns would give the Bible, I don't know what Pete Enns would think. In a lot of ways, the question is, how privileged do you make your Bible with respect to other books? And, you've got Vervaeke and company with Ritnar, with a religion that's not a religion. And so they're in many ways trying to address blurry vision. And, of course, Vervaeke's project is very focused on weeding out bullshittery and bias and all sorts of other mixed signals. And in some ways, John Vervaeke's really taken a very broad scientific approach to this. It's obvious we need something that serves as religion. And again, as Jordan Peterson said in his religion question, you're going to go out and do it and find it, so you might as well do a good job with it. And if you go back to Jordan Peterson's conversation with Michael Shermer, Peterson makes the point that most people are really bad at this, so actually you're better off if you inherit it. It's sort of the difference of if your company would hand you your retirement money and say, well, here's your retirement money, do something productive with it. Or, as in my case, there's actually a pension fund that the pension money goes into, and they're going to, in the Christian Reformed Church, it's still, well, you'll get this pension for the rest of your life, no matter how long you live, as long as the money's still there, as opposed to here's a defined benefits or defined contributions Those are the two sides of it. Give people if it's a divine contributions, you give people their retirement money up front. Well, they're like, well, good, I'm in charge of it. Well, how good of a money manager are you? And for me, in the Christian Reformed Church, it's kind of, well, I'm glad the denomination is taking care of it for me, because it probably wouldn't be a very good one. So, upon retirement, it's not a big pension. There'll be a little pension for me, and hopefully with that and Social Security and some other things, we'll be okay. So that's what you do. And so blurry vision doesn't really help. Blur is just signal to noise. And so I find this progressive evangelical approach to the Bible just blurry. And yeah, okay, it's feeling better now. I get that. Now the pressure's off in terms of, oh, my parents told me this about gays and women and premarital sex. And, in a letter I responded to someone who asked that question about, we'll get a lot of same-sex attracted people from the CRC on your channel. That's an element of the data, but it's by no means the whole picture, because in the Christian Reformed Church, there's all sorts of changes that have happened. Sabbatarian practices, 30, 40 years ago in the Christian Reformed Church, if a Christian Reformed Church family went on vacation, they would pick a vacation spot where they could find a Christian Reformed Church nearby, because they're not going to, maybe a Reformed Church in America church, if push comes to shove. But, they're going to go to church on Sunday, vacation or no vacation, and it should be a Christian Reformed Church. That was the culture of the people. Now you can say, well, did they get that rule from the Bible? Well, that's sort of how it felt to them, but this is where the whole rules thing gets complicated too, because is the Bible a book of rules? Yeah, there are rules in the Bible. And if you say, well, there are rules in the Bible, but that's not really what the Bible is, so don't worry about the rules. Well, now you've just sort of taken something away from the Bible that actually you probably need, because you do need rules, because rules are helpful and important. But then the question is, well, which rules and how are they to be applied? And to Pete Enns' point, you look at someone like Naaman and Elisha. Well, Naaman says, hey, when I got to kneel down in the temple of Dagon to my master, how's the Lord who took away my leprosy going to heal it? Think about that. Now, again, a lot of blurriness just says, well, that's just kind of a story. Okay, it's just kind of a story. But if the story is going to do something for me, it can't just be blurry. It needs to be crunchy. And that's the point of the resurrection of Jesus, because if you just simply mythologize it, you sort of mythologize it away, and then it's of no use to me. And this, I think, is where some of the strange magic of Jonathan Pageau comes in, because and Pageau clearly gives mixed signals or signals that people don't often understand. I certainly had that experience with him early on. Rationality Rules had that experience, but his movement has been growing strong. What's with that? And I just did my conversation with Mark, and I sort of located Mark in the Vervaeke camp. He says, no, I'm really in the Pageau camp. Yeah, you're not going to an Orthodox church. You're not even going to a Catholic church. I love my conversation with Mark. Mark's a fun guy to talk to. I know some of you don't like him, but I do. I always have that with some of the people I bring on. And I was telling one guy, I'm not going to stop until I bring on someone on the channel who's probably going to reliably annoy and anger a certain demographic of my population. I mean, that's just the way it should be. But I've been thinking more, I've been focusing more on the question, okay, what's going on in the Pageau world here? Not just what's he saying and what's he thinking, but what's the world around him? Because again, with Jordan Peterson, there's the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, which is a big thing, but there's the Jonathan Pageau phenomenon too. And, Carl, who unsubscribed from the channel, he's quite famous in the comment section for a good while. Carl, who unsubscribed from the channel, so I'm listening to Jonathan Pageau now. And it's like, because, Carl's big complaint was too much God number 2. And, okay. And yeah, you hear a ton of God number one through Pageau, but then you have the crying game moment with rationality rules. You're not one of those Christians that actually believes in a God up there. The symbolism memes nailed that one exactly. I should play that.
Most people just simply really do believe that a conscious being called God exists, that is looking at who he sleeps with and on what position. You don't have that position. From my understanding, you don't even believe that there is a conscious being called God out there.
Wait.
Most people just simply really do believe that a conscious being called God exists, that is looking at who he sleeps with and on what position. You don't have that position. From my understanding, you don't even believe that there is a conscious being called God out there.
Wait.
Most people.
If you haven't watched, if you're not subscribed to this channel, you're really missing out. Here's another favorite.
And I'm like, pattern, Pageau.
There you go.
There you go.
Let the meme guys get a hold of that
let
one.
Let the symbolic memes guy go.
Mushroom.
So, there's just like 3 years ago, and in some ways I asked myself, well, what's going on around Jordan Peterson? Something's happening with that. And, it still is, but, something's going on around Jonathan Pageau, and that's worth looking at. Now, blurry skepticism feels like freedom if your first draft still governs. I'm always looking for language to talk about things like this. And I think with someone who has, again, these things move multi-generationally. And so someone like God is Gray, who was raised by, going to church, and when she talks about her, before her deconstruction, how she was, she sounds like she was a, evangelical Bible thumper. And then this big change. And now, of course, she's, having a YouTube channel gives you all sorts of reinforcement. And hers is bigger, double the size of Pageau's. So, YouTube gives us numbers that'll give us a sense. But will her impact be twice that of Pageau's? I don't think so, because these things don't sort of work just according to the analytics. But why do religious people look for basic pattern and substitution? And that's sort of what we're talking about here, because that's really how religious narratives work. It's pattern and substitution. The genius of Pageau is that in an age where, so again, you used to have sort of God number one and God number two fully integrated together, at least ideally in the faith, or at least not fully integrated, but somewhat integrated together. What happens in deism is that God number one there sort of was a divorce in the church over a number 100 years, and one party got God number one, but it wasn't God. It was just the impersonal world of laws of physics and such. And the other party, well, eventually, and this is quite recent, Charles Colson, Born Again, doubled down on God number two. But if you have God number two and not God number one, you sort of slip into a polytheism. So why do religious people look for basic pattern substitution? This is what religion is for. And I don't mean religion in terms of supernatural stuff and church stuff and religion like secularity, but religion worldview. It's the same way the Greeks were religious but didn't know they were. It's the same way Tara Isabel Burton notes that people are religious, but if you ask them, see, even that's changing. If you ask them, are you religious? No, but I'm spiritual. And other people, I've got to make up something brand new out of that, so I'll be religious but not spiritual. And round we go. And of course, I don't think anybody talks in a more compelling way about some of those dynamics as Jonathan. He's got a good way of sort of laying it down, because he spots it all the time and he brings it up and he brings it out in his videos. So yeah, pattern recognition and substitution. In some ways, that's religion. And this is the pattern that the world represents in the story, because the story is a massive compression engine, and you are an agent in the story, and somehow you go into the story and you pursue an outcome in the story. That's pretty much how religion works. It's also how technology works in many ways. This is basically how people work. Our identities are quite malleable. And, I really enjoyed this universal history video that he just put out. Boy, that was good. I listened to that video, and I just took my phone and I drank that video down. And now the meme guys are going to do something with that. Why? Boy, I've only begun to think about that video, and it's going to take a little while to really digest it, because there's so much going on there about how we are and who we are and how we operate and what religion is and what religion is for. And they didn't talk that way directly, but that's what that video is about. Now, I think about it in terms of, okay, that Reformed hermeneutic, and I look at some of these people, and there's one woman here pictured who, she lost her husband when she had, 4, 5, 6 boys, all sons, living right over in, Patterson, Prospect Park. And she was often a babysitter for me when I was a child. She and a bunch of these older women, this was during the 60s, 50s, 60s, when people were moving out to the suburbs. The Dutch who had been in the New York, New Jersey area were becoming economically successful, and African Americans were moving up from the South to sort of continue to work in that area. And so there was some white flight, but some of those women, and her a widow who never remarried because she didn't trust any other man raising her boys, and her boys loved her. Her boys would do anything for her because they know what she sacrificed, so that, I'm sure she pinched pennies so they could go to Christian school. The whole 9 yards, that whole package of what the Christian Reformed Church was in the 1950s and 60s. And then when her boys are out of the house, how does she spend her time? She goes down to the Northside Gospel Mission, and she pours herself into the African Americans in that community in her own way. Her and Angie Vogel, same thing. But that's what she does. And that Reformed hermeneutic, well, what was that? That was how you please God. That was how you live your life. And you draw that from the Bible. And I should grab a book. So in the 1960s, the Christian Reformed Church would put out books like this by Thea Van Halsema and the Reverend Richard de Ruyter. And this was probably someone outlining their little scarf thing from their cadets and Calvinettes. You know this because there's an entire subculture around this. And basically what books like this would do would be to tell the history. And you'd have the Bible, the church in the Old Testament, and the church from Noah to Abraham, and the church from Moses to the prophets, and the church from the prophets in the Old Testament, the place of Christ in the church, and then on to the Holy Spirit and the church. And, Pageau and Richard, I forget his last name, talked about Constantine. And yeah, this is how it went. So explaining the Apostles' Creed, and you just jump from, the Christian Reformed Church has deacon and elders because you find deacons and elders in the Bible. Now there's a lot of history that came up through there, but the Christian Reformed Church is one of these denominations that it's a sort of a restorationism, pushing back against those city elites in the Netherlands. And, then they immigrated to the United States. And so then you had some of that frontier ethos that Mark Knoll wrote about in a piece that I'd read a number of times. The church, our church government, I mean, it just has all of this stuff here. And reading this today feels so undeconstructed. Well, here we are. This is... Now, of course, looking at it today says, well, it's kind of CRC and it's kind of 1950s America too, isn't it? Yeah. But they didn't want Blur. And then, of course, the Navajo mission and Johanna Veenstra in Africa. And we got symbols here on the back. People with a solid first draft privilege can sort of surf the blur. And the Bible gave people a draft from which to work with. And again, I think about Jordan Peterson's comment to Michael Shermer. I mean, that's what happens with these videos. I watch these videos and you kind of watch them through and you don't really know what parts are relevance realization. And then you're talking and, oh yeah, with Michael Shermer. Oh yeah. They need a draft to work from, and you need a hermeneutic and you need a rule. And blurry doesn't help. You've got privilege if you're going to surf the blur. Because if you don't have that privilege and you're surfing the blur, it feels like chaos and lostness, and you're probably going to find a place that's less blurry. And when I look at the rise and interest of the Orthodox, yeah. Because it's ancient, and because here it is, and because it's instantiated. And it's instantiated in the mosaics and the tiles and the paint of the building that you're in, if you have enough money and enough people to kind of do one. And and so it's not surprising to me that you sort of have this strange amalgamation between immigrants from Eastern Europe that, of course, have been coming over and refugees from the meaning crisis and the blurring that's been going on for the last 20, 30 years, blurring in order to deal with the radical changes in our society and the disruption by technology. I almost did a commentary video on the Benjamin Boyce Pageau video. That was an excellent conversation. But I might do a conversation on Jonathan's interview on history, because there's so much, and what I really wanted was a Tom Holland commentary on that video. It was good. And to look at these people outside, they're very proud of their Northside Gospel mission in this army surplus tent. I remember those tents. Now, the tent was gone as the main church building by the time I had memory, or I could at least autobiographize my life. But, these people, they meant well. They had a surety. They had a confidence. And again, we might look at them as sort of naive, but let's own a little bit of our privilege there, boys and girls. Sure, they had their doubts, but they pressed forward and they said, well, we got our doubts, but we're gonna mean business and we're gonna do that. And it doesn't mean that they didn't continue to do the fact narrative dance. I wrote a Substack. Again, I said I've started this Substack, and usually when I have a smaller thought or not enough time for a video and I just want to get something down, because again, all these videos are getting stuff down. They're all rough drafts. They're all first drafts. But I was watching the Pageau Boyce video and had some thoughts, and still might do a commentary video on that. It's so weird what this afternoon I had a little time. Thought I got a little time to do a video. I feel like Mr. Incredible. When early in The Incredibles, when he's driving around and he's heading to his wedding, and he's like, I think I get a little time to to rescue this cat up in the tree, and I get a little time to stop this bank robbery. For me, it's like, I get a little time to make a video. What am I going to make it up? What am I going to make it about? And then, because during the course of the day, I have 4, 5, 6 videos that pop into my mind. Think, I want to make a video about that. I want to make a video about that. But I don't have an hour to sit down and talk to this machine. So maybe I'll just run to Twitter and, have a little 3 or 5 tweet thread. And now I'm incorporating that into the Substack. So that's sort of part of my process now. But maybe I should read some of that. Part of the ironies of evangelism is that, we don't really quite know what we're doing with all of this. And for someone like Jonathan Pageau, who, again, when people start listening to him and they think that they're doing a lot of projection on him, and they're doing a lot of modernist projection on him, and it's like, you don't understand how deeply conservative in many ways this stuff is. And you look at him and, he's cool. He speaks French so well. And, he's a good looking guy, and he's got art, and he's nice, and he's got a fun laugh. But the dude is serious. And that's why he's got a following, because if he was less serious, he wouldn't. If it was more blurry, he's not blurry at all. Neither is Jordan Peterson. And so, when people begin to sort of figure out what this all means and entails, they get a little nervous. I'll just read some of what I had and comment on it. I've been spending 3 years pondering Jordan Peterson's impact on the world. Jonathan Pageau's conversation with Benjamin Boyce got me pondering Pageau's growing evangelistic influence. In my John Vervaeke thoughts, that didn't make sense. That's a problem with a lot of my writing. I don't edit it, and it gets screwy. So this video that I did with Vervaeke on why relate to a personal God, or why relate to a God personally, kind of ran through that argument. And at the end, John rightly says, you're not making an argument about his ontology. No, I'm making an argument about what you need to do in your meaning crisis to survive. If you don't have, a lot of first draft privilege, if you can't, surf the blur, you need to engage with the world seriously. This is why people join cults. And, John would very quickly, John's such a good conversation partner. He keeps me honest, say, yeah, but, people will join all sorts of things. Well, fair enough. But we have to use the spirit of finesse. We engage the world with that spirit of finesse. We engage the world as if things sometimes that we know, or quite likely know, are not personal. We treat them as if they are, because that's the right mode of relationship in order that we need. And likely, historically, Darwinianly is the most successful. Adam Friended constantly reminds me that part of why he liked Jordan Peterson is because he stays on the side of the natural rather than the supernatural. And so Adam a lot of times would say, Paul, if you'd give up on the God number 2 stuff, and that's exactly Carl's complaint. Vanderklay doesn't give up on the God number 2 stuff. A deep part of modernity is post-deism, Irenic impersonalism. There's something for you. Post-deism, Irenic impersonalism. What does that mean? It means that the universe is dead. And, it's, again, people, you have this, the new atheists would talk about this overactive agency detector, but, they can't suss out the truth of the universe any better than we can. Those of us who see the universe as an agentic arena. God number 1 is Irenic, and God number 2 is agentic. The agentic God has been thoroughly attacked in modernity. In some ways, that's the point of modernity. I think partly because we, in our quest for the monarchical vision, we slide ourselves into that slot. I have to think about that more. Now, Jonathan Pageau uses a persuasive, universal, impersonal pattern. Remember? Pattern, 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 mushroom. Pattern, 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 pattern. Well, a pattern is sort of a halfway house there, because it's non-threatening to talk about a pattern, because it's a pattern. And we've got terrific pattern agency detectors. And so when rationality rules, here's Jonathan Pageau talking about patterns. Well, patterns are not conscious. They're natural. They just lay themselves out. That's what, the reality lays itself out. You'll hear Pageau say that again and again and again and again. And so how are people hearing that? Well, that's comforting. But what does Jonathan really think? And he doesn't hide what he really thinks. They just hear him in a certain way. And we project on each other madly about what we want and what we need. And so his pattern sort of becomes a halfway house to God number one. And the arena has patterns. Modern skittishness of the arena at God number two. God number two, a conscious God, a choosing God. Oh, can't have God choose. Dread Calvinists have God choosing. God sucking up all the agency and leaving none for me. That's what we fear, right? So impersonality is colonized by agency. It always is. That's why we love impersonal things, because agency, by definition, colonizes the impersonal and that which can be colonized. Jonathan Pageau sort of lures them in. Hey, it's just a pattern. It's just a pattern. Nothing to be afraid of here. You can stand, you can watch it, you can see it in the movies, you see it here, you see it there, you see it everywhere. It's pattern, 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 pattern. Mushroom. There's the psychedelics get their thing in there. But I think Pageau knows more than people are hearing. And of course, that's what's exciting about him. You come for the patterns and you stay for the God. You come for the patterns and you stay for the church. You come for the patterns and you stay for the love. That's both where all the, it's the infatuation of first falling in love ends with the exciting horror that there's a person on the other side of the projection that you've been crushing on for how long? One of my favorite titles. Rationality Rules Crying Game Moment with Jonathan Pageau. Super Thing Theism debunked. Dum, dum, dum. And I ended that with this great piece from C.S. Lewis from, of course, his book Miracles. Men are reluctant to pass over from the notion of an abstract and negative deity to the living God. I do not wonder. Here lies the deepest taproot of pantheism and of objection to traditional imagery. And see, again, now we're 70 years since Lewis wrote that. And so the objection to traditional imagery that, we're like this giant or psychological organism. Well, now I'm into Jung. We're this giant psychological collective organism, and we have collective feelings, and we're all these little nodes of it, but that's what's processing. And, in the 1950s, they were still, and of course it depends where you are in a culture, we're more reactive to Christianity, but now that it's receded, it's just a little bit safe. It's, as Christopher Mastro Pietro, it's the dying glow of this sun out there. It was hated not at bottom because it pictured him, capital H, as a man, but because it pictured him as a king or even a warrior. The pantheist God does nothing, demands nothing. Patterns, you see, again, they're sort of in the middle here. He is there if you wish for him, like a book on a shelf. He will not pursue you. There is no danger at any time. Heaven and earth should flee away at his glance. If he were the truth, then we could really say that all the Christian images of kingship were a historical accident of which our religion ought to be cleansed. It is with a shock that we discover them to be indispensable. That's what Pageau was doing. They're indispensable. And so, well, the Reformed hermeneutic, what is indispensable? That's what we need to know, because indispensable is indispensable. Should women do these things? What about divorce? What about Sabbath observance? What about finding that CRC on your family vacation? What about having to send your kids to Christian school? What about tithing? You have had a shock like that before in connection with smaller things. When the line pulls at your hand, when you're fishing, you had 5 kids, take them out to a pond, throw the rod in, and I got one! How big's the fish? It's always shocking to meet life where we thought we were alone. Look out, we cry, it's alive! And therefore is the very point at which so many draw back. I would have done so myself if I could, Lewis says, and proceed no further with Christianity. An impersonal God, well and good. A subjective God of beauty, truth, and goodness inside our own heads, better still. A formless life force surging through us, a vast power which we can tap, best of all, the force. But God himself alive, pulling at the other end of the cord, perhaps approaching at an infinite speed, the hunter, king, husband. That's quite another matter. There comes a moment when the children who have been playing at burglars hush suddenly. Was that a real footstep in the hall? There comes a moment when people who have been dabbling in religion, man's search for God, suddenly draw back. Supposing we really found him, capital H. We never meant it to come to that. Worse still, suppose he has found us. Comment. The last paragraph of C.S. Lewis' quote reminds me of Slavoj Žižek's commentary about why the fundamentalist is mocked. What a fool, we cry. He dares to take his faith seriously. These hermeneutics change. Len Vandezee, who's been on the channel, wrote quite a good post. He said, that Reformed hermeneutic didn't stop a whole bunch of other things going on. Rightly so. What do we want from that Reformed hermeneutic? Well, we want everything. Well, the only way to get everything is to get God, or to have God have you, to have God marry you, for him to be the husband, for him to be the colonizer, for us to be the Mary, for him to come at us, warrior, king, husband, lover. That's when the real fun begins.